I'm Emma Howard-Boyd, I'm Chair of the Environment Agency, and this session is all about the role of government in restoring natural capital. And I really wanted to start off by asking each of our panellists to make some very brief comments on the overarching subject, but in relation to what we have just heard. I think there's a sense of urgency and pace, and that real challenge that now is the moment to really get going on this whole agenda of natural capital. But I'm also painfully aware that it's complicated. Some of it is quite theoretical, and we need to get on and start delivering and making change. So I'm going to ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves and talk to that challenge.
Okay, thank you. And we've got about 2 minutes, haven't we?
Yes.
Thank you very much. I'm Zach Goldsmith. I'm an MP for Richmond Park in North Kingston by a whisker, one of the smallest whiskers in Parliament at this particular moment. Nice to see a couple of constituents who are part of my 45 majority. So this is not just I think most people here have to agree now that we have the greatest opportunity we've had probably in our lifetimes, no matter how old we are in this room, to fundamentally address the issues that we've just heard. Some great speeches for Tony, your speech was superb, Michael Gove, Dieter Helm. We heard some really exciting stuff, and the opportunity is there for 3 reasons. One, Michael Gove. We have in Michael Gove a champion. I was talking to a radical environmentalist 2 days ago, who I've worked with since I was a teenager. He said, he hasn't said anything I disagree with yet. And the idea that a radical environmentalist would say that about a Conservative Secretary of State and someone with no prior history, particularly of getting involved in these issues, is just extraordinary. So that is a big opportunity for us. It may not last, because politicians move around, but right now it's a massive opportunity. The second reason is the public. You look at the response of the public, not just here but around the world, to the Blue Planet series. It was extraordinary. One of the most powerful documentaries ever produced by humanity, I believe. You can measure that success by the number of people who downloaded it and the political pressure we politicians now feel. Kerry, I'm sure, would agree with that, on the back of that campaign. And the third reason this opportunity exists is Brexit. Now, whatever one thinks about Brexit, it forces a profound rethink. And in relation to the environment, and particularly in relation to the common agriculture, that is huge. If we shift from a system which effectively pays billions of pounds a year to people simply for owning land, no matter what they do to that land, to a system that rewards landowners and farmers for delivering genuine public goods, which we'll be talking about in a few seconds, what does that actually mean, then we will be transforming our countryside. And it's more complicated than that, clearly, and over the next 45 minutes we'll be talking about it, but it is a giant opportunity. And for my part, as somebody who's campaigned on these issues for years, I feel totally exhilarated to be involved in this campaign, to be working alongside people who are actually excited by these issues in Parliament for a change. It is a great moment, and we've got to seize the opportunity.
Brilliant.
Okay, I don't think I disagree with anything that Zach said. I mean, unlike Zach, I voted Remain, and I still have huge concerns about Brexit. I didn't really share Michael Gove's assessment of the things that Remainers ought to be happy about, like the supposed boom in manufacturing that there's been since the vote. I don't sort of recognise that. But I do think, I certainly share the criticisms of the Common Agricultural Policy, and I do think we have a massive opportunity in front of us. I also don't think... I think the one thing we did disagree with Michael Gove on was when he expressed support for glyphosates and pesticides at DEFRA questions a few months ago. But apart from that, there's most of the things he says I agree with. The question is whether he actually does what he says and is ambitious enough, and also whether his colleagues allow him to do that. And that's partly whether there's a risk of him being reshuffled because he's too radical and he's upsetting too many traditional voices that have traditionally dominated policy in this area in government, or I think that you can spend too much time focusing on what a change in the subsidy regime will mean. If you don't put that in the whole context of the trade deals that we enter into, then the subsidies don't count for very much. And there's this real power battle, I think, going on within the cabinet between what Michael Gove says and what Liam Fox says. And I think that's certainly a battle where I would come down on Michael Gove's side. And so I think the other thing that concerns me to an extent, and it's not particularly about Michael Gove, but it's again about the approach of the government, is there has always traditionally been a reluctance to see that government is the key player in all this. So they're very keen on nudge theory and the market responding to consumer demand, and we see quite a lot of that in all the discussions now about whether, for example, we're going to take action on disposable coffee cups or deposit return schemes and so on. And there is quite a strong strand of ideological thought within the Conservative Party that says, you know, you take the voluntary approach, you educate, you inform, you put labels on things, but the government doesn't actually step up to the plate and achieve. It's the difference between achieving change at a very slow incremental level and actually achieving radical change overnight. And if you look at where government has intervened, the landfill tax, for example, made a massive difference. I think something like 90% of our waste was going to landfill 15 years ago. Landfill tax was government action that transformed that. The plastic bag charge, you know, a very small measure, 85% reduction in plastic bag use. And I would use as an example, you know, microbeads ban 0.4%, I think, of microplastics and microbeads. So the government is acting, but at the moment they act, you should be calling on them to act further and be more ambitious. And I think that, so I would say government action means regulating. It means financial incentives for, you know, how can we use either fiscal rewards or disincentives to encourage certain behaviour. But it also means enforcement. And again, I think that's something that we would worry about post-Brexit as to how you actually enforce some of these changes you want to see.
Brilliant, thank you. Craig?
Thank you. Well, I would agree with a lot of what's been said here, and I agree, Zach, you know, it is actually quite an exhilarating time to be having these conversations, and that's good. But I think there's three key points I want to sort of throw out there just for us to think about. The first is that I think we're having a very one-sided debate at the moment for very obvious political reasons. And that is that a lot of the deregulators out there in politics at the moment are keeping quiet right now, and certainly until the other side of March 2019, because the deregulators that supported Brexit don't want anything to screw up the Brexit project at the moment. So they're purposely keeping very quiet and allowing this sort of to go through as it is. But that's not always going to be the case. And sooner or later they'll come out and then be pushing for that kind of deregulation. The forces that led to this, the reason why so many people really relied on EU legislation in the past for this are still there. And we often talk, there's this conversation about the common agricultural policy at the moment as if it's been entirely something that's been done to us rather than by us. You know, actually we should recognise that the fundamental industrial agricultural nature of the common agricultural policy, the UK was one of the biggest cheerleaders for that over many, many decades. You know, those big farming barons of East Anglia pushed very hard for a common agricultural policy that rewarded a deeply unsustainable form of agriculture. Now, those forces haven't gone away. They're just keeping quiet at this precise moment. And we've got to be smart about this and not kind of think that suddenly we're in a Brexit, post-Brexit Britain where everyone kind of loves regulation and saving the environment and so on. We're not. There's just a very distorted political conversation going on at this precise moment in 2018. I suspect it will be different in 2019. The second thing to say is it's great to be having this discussion about public money for public goods. That's great. And of course, it's well recognised we've got to have a discussion about what we really mean by public goods. But we've also got to have a discussion about what we mean by public bads. That's just as important. What are the things we actually want to stop? And there's so many of them that are just complete nonsense. I'll give you one example at the moment, which is metaldehyde. I don't know if any of you have heard of this. This is this appalling slug pellet that is put all over fields right across the UK by farmers. Essentially, they use the funding from the Common Agricultural Policy to subsidise this, to put it all over fields, to kill slugs, and it ends up in water courses. And the mad thing is, as taxpayers, we're paying for this, subsidising this through the Common Agricultural Policy, and then as water bill payers, we have to pay hundreds of millions every year to have very expensive water treatment works to then pull it out at the other end. Yeah. The simple thing here is just to ban it. There are alternatives to metaldehyde that still deal with slugs for farmers, but we could get on and ban it, but it hasn't been happening. And so we're not seeing the action from DEFRA right here, right now, this year, that perhaps would build trust and confidence in this very welcome narrative that's coming from Michael Gove. And the final point is we absolutely, in 2018, Michael Gove wants to build that trust and confidence. He's been doing a pretty good job so far, but if he wants to build it, we really have to make sure that that withdrawal bill is as strong as it possibly can be. And when I asked that question earlier about why aren't the polluter pays principle and the precautionary principle in the withdrawal bill, it was very nice that Michael gave warm words in support of those principles, but he didn't actually answer my question as to why it's not in the withdrawal bill. There's no good reason that we've been given by anyone in government at the moment as to why they're not in the withdrawal bill. And I do worry in this whole debate at the moment, there's lots of promises being made in 2018 that perhaps might evaporate the other side of March 2019. But let's see.
Thank you. And then Amy.
Thank you. I'm Amy Mounts. I coordinate the Greener UK coalition of environmental charities, which was created in the aftermath of the EU referendum, driven by two kind of main insights. The one that Brexit is probably the greatest challenge we've faced as a sector for, I don't know, a generation, pick your timescale, because of the volume of environmental standards that are kind of embedded in EU law at the moment, and the importance of international cooperation, and the EU has been one of the main mechanisms for enabling that cooperation. But the second insight was that this is clearly a time of big political change, big upheaval, and if stuff's changing, let's make it work for the better. And I think it's great that this conference is called Green Brexit, because this is not just about, it can't just be about keeping stuff the same, mitigating the risk, the environmental risks of leaving the EU. It's got to be about how are we doing this better? How are we going to use the UK as a laboratory for the world of different ideas, creative policy ideas that the world so desperately needs? And I think Tony made some of these points in his speech as well as did Michael Gove, in fact, that the world needs leadership. These are some of the issues that are going to define the 21st century. So let's seize that, but equally let's not hang around. We've really got to turn this positive conversation, this positive rhetoric into reality, and we've got to start doing that this year. So that's about embedding these ambitions into the EU withdrawal agreement and the future relationship with the European Union, on the one hand, on the international hand, but also domestically in legislation. And we've got the agriculture bill coming up, we've got the fisheries bill as well as the withdrawal bill. These are all opportunities, but we do need an environment bill as well. There's been this fantastic promise of an ambitious sort of world-class green watchdog from the Secretary of State. That's brilliant, and I think actually the crux of environmental success after Brexit is going to be about whether we can craft a really robust, forward-facing, dynamic governance system, and so the watchdog will be really pivotal to that. But also we need to be embedding that ambition as well. So just today, the sort of joint committee of MPs on air pollution has recommended we need a new Clean Air Act. I would say we need to go further. Clean air is obviously a vital target that we should be aiming for and delivering on, but there's a whole host of other environmental issues as well. And we need to be looking at this holistically, because none of these kind of exist in isolation, as Dieter Helm was talking about, in relation to the sort of natural assets way of thinking about it. This is a system, it's not just, you can't chunk it up into bits. So those would be my main points, as well as the final point about the role of government. It's also about cooperating with other governments. So that's internationally, but it's also within the UK, and we're in a situation where a lot of environmental policy is devolved. Obviously, there's a lot of tension at the moment around Clause 11 in the withdrawal bill and where powers are exactly going to lie after Brexit and so on. But the really key thing here is that governments have to work together for the interest of the environment, and at some point we need to move on to that conversation as well.
Brilliant. So as chair of the Environment Agency, I was delighted the day after the 25-year environment plan was launched to be out in Cornwall announcing some funding for a sustainability and plastics team, really wanting to demonstrate that we're out there doing things immediately after the launch. And I think what the 25-year environment plan does is raise expectations, and I think it's that mood of and that tone of expectation set that we all need to be grasping and feeding back to the Environment Secretary that he has raised expectations by linking the 25-year Environment Plan to the Clean Growth Strategy, and that this is about embedding the environment into government making decisions. And I think it's that expectations raised that gives us a huge opportunity to help deliver on some of the things that the panelists have raised. I'm really keen to open the discussion up to Q&A because I know there's a lot of expertise in the room. So if we could take a couple of short questions, comments, and then go back to the panelists, and then just get the debate going. So thank you. Would you like to introduce yourself?
So, Alex Wolfe, I look after the southeast of England for Certus Energy, the UK's largest fuel distributor. We supply the majority of the farming agriculture community, but also government and government projects, and probably over 100,000 businesses in the UK. I had a question about two roles of government. One, government procures more big infrastructure products, and especially the UK government than anywhere in the real Western world. And my question is, why is there still not really an environmental part of that procurement? So in terms of fuel supply, we are challenged on cost and delivery windows, but we're not challenged on NOx or particulate. And the second question I've got in terms of the role of government is that ultimately they have big desires that our population wants, such as more affordable housing. Creating housing has a huge energy issue to it in terms of actually turning whether it's a brownfield site or any other type of site into a housing site. And again, I've met with lots of local governments, lots of housing builders, and the question is, I would love to take a product that reduces NOx and particulate. So for instance, we've got this here, GTL, which is a paraffin-based direct replacement of diesel, reduces your NOx by 90%, and your NOx by 40%, your particulate by 90%. But because there's no support on those issues, as government is the big buyer, or projects that are very much related to government policy, how do we change that? And because it seems so many different departments you need to speak to, rather than just being able to get everyone around a table.
Brilliant. And can we take a second comment question?
Benjamin Bilski, Pericles Foundation, and a day job at DCMS. I've been thinking for some time about questions relating to innovative environmental policies, especially those that have both an environmental and an economic positive impact. And looking at several organizations around the world that are working on this in areas of agriculture, energy, and also in infrastructure and innovation. I wonder what is currently being looked at, because I don't have a big insight in the environmental discourse at the moment, to considering the work done, for example, by the Common Land Foundation of the Netherlands, that is working on focusing on restoring ecosystems first, and on top of that, restoring agricultural systems, on top of that, human and social. And they take a very broad and holistic approach, both from the environmental, the ecological, and the economic, as well as the social impact of these kinds of approaches. Now, Professor Helm mentioned systems approach is needed, and to assess the capital value of natural assets, but in a way the ecosystem as a whole is difficult to monetize. It's the products that come out of it that are monetized. So I wonder what is done in this direction and what is being looked at. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So who'd like to give a response? Zach, would you like to?
Yeah, sure. In reverse order, I think that there are almost everything that needs to be done is being done already somewhere. It's just not all happening under one umbrella. If you want to find the solution to today's problems, there'll be someone out there doing it. And the truth is that business, in many respects, not all businesses obviously, but there are businesses that are way ahead of the politicians on this issue. You've got, in this country, you've got water companies paying farmers not to put pesticides in the water precisely for the reason that was given earlier, because it means they don't have to spend money clearing it up later. You've got water companies paying farmers to manage floodplains differently, to slow down the water and prevent the need for hugely expensive defences later on. That ties in absolutely with the stuff that Dieter Helm was talking about, and there will be a synergy between private sector and government and public funding when it comes to more innovative land management practices. It's not just here. You have huge swathes of forest in Vietnam, which are protected now because the people who live in them are paid by the energy companies, energy coming from hydro. We spend hundreds of millions of pounds on technology, on capital infrastructure, and then when it gets silted up, they lose their investment. They don't want it to be silted up. The best way to do that is to keep the forest standing. So there are hundreds of these examples all around the world. Our job is to try and use this transformation of what CAP is to what it will become to ensure that we facilitate that stuff on a wider scale. But it's not just about new things. It's also about stopping bad things from happening. And I'm going to slightly go back to the point that Kerry made, because I don't disagree actually with anything she said. There are huge risks. We could screw this up. And there is a tension in government. And the Liam Fox takes a different line to Michael Gove. We're lucky that Michael Gove is an argument winner. He's somebody who's very, very powerful in government. And I'm terrified of him being promoted, because I think that he'd probably hate me for saying that. But because this is the opportunity. When he goes, we may have a tougher job on our hands. But the free market sort of fanatics in the party, their view at its purest end is not irreconcilable with what we're talking about. So if you imagine you run a pig farm and you stuff your pigs with antibiotics every single day just to keep them alive in conditions where they would otherwise not be able to live, and then sell that meat as cheap food, we know it's not cheap. It's not cheap because by abusing antibiotics, we're destroying a resource, one of the most valuable medical resources our species has ever known, in order to make that stuff cheap. What is the cost of entering the post-antibiotic age? What is the cost of that? It's devastating to our species. You can't even put a cost on it. So when we talk about cheap food, we're not really talking about cheap food. We're talking about heavily subsidized food. And so part of the challenge is to remove those practices by attaching a cost to polluting or destructive activities, as well as rewarding those things which we need to see happen. Your question on procurement, absolutely critical. Governments have been hopeless on this, or successive governments have. Kerry and I are on the same committee, Environment Audit Committee. We were both, I think you were on the air quality one as well, weren't you?
No, I didn't.
I was our appointee from the Environment Audit Committee onto this other joint committee on air quality, and we looked at this issue, and the amount of lower polluting or zero pollution cars being bought by government departments is almost zilch. I mean, I think the Ministry of Defence has one in its basement that's never been used. I may be exaggerating, it might be two, but either way, if it's two, two of them haven't been used. So procurement is a huge area. It's also at the local level. You look at air pollution, NOx, 14% of the stuff that we breathe in that is causing us harm is emitted by construction vehicles. And many of those construction companies are awarded contracts by local government, by City Hall, or by national government. And there's absolutely nothing stopping governments at any level saying, we are not going to award contracts to construction companies whose vehicles have not been retrofitted. If you did that at the stroke of a pen, simply using the government's our buying power effectively, you'd be dealing with the 14% of a problem which is blighting 40,000 lives, shortening 40,000 lives every year. So there are millions of examples of where procurement, the policy could be tightened up and made to work in the interest of the agenda we're talking about today. It was a very long answer, sorry.
Right. Kerry, would you like to say something?
Yeah,
and then
I don't think, I mean, again, we're just going to agree with each other on everything, I think. But I think particularly, I would love to see a similar approach to food that Dieter Helm's taken to the natural capital side of things. Because pricing, I can see Vicky is nodding away there, but pricing in the externalities of food production and then using that to make the argument that cheap food comes at a huge cost, whether it's the carbon footprint, whether it's the antibiotics, routine overuse and the impact on public health, the obesity crisis, diabetes, etc., etc. And I think that's one of the things that is, I know the command paper is primarily a paper about agriculture, but I think it's very difficult to look at agriculture unless you look at the whole food system. And on the procurement front, I mean, France, for example, I think has a rule that public bodies, 50% of their food procurement has to be either locally sourced or organic, and which is brilliant in terms of supporting local markets, supporting healthy food. But it would come at a much bigger cost because inevitably that food is going to be come at a premium price. And I think we really need to look at, if we can't put a requirement on the public sector, the health service, for example, I think it would be great if there was a requirement on them to source healthy, locally produced food. But you can't do that under current NHS financing regime. So you've got to look at both sides of the equation. In terms of house building, I mean, this is a tiny little example, but I think I'm a swift species champion for the RSPB, And there's a campaign for to just have new build housing, to have nesting places, you know, bricks missing, so that the swifts can nest in there, because the loss of habitat is massive. You could talk about the same thing with hedgehogs and housing developments. Just things like that don't cost an awful lot, but if you made it a requirement, you could actually help reverse the decline in biodiversity that we're seeing. Yeah.
So Craig, Amy, short comments?
I just need to say something about public procurement, because I'm a bit of a public procurement geek and I get very excited about that. But the real point about this is, and what's often missed, is we're thinking about making small little tweaks to public procurement contracts. The really exciting thing is what's called forward procurement compacts, where you kind of actually, the opportunity for government to specify an unmet need and to stimulate innovation to deliver something completely new that doesn't exist yet. There's one really good example when a government's done this before, and it was about 15 years ago here in this country, when HM Prison Service at the time was throwing away 60,000 prison mattresses every year, going straight to landfill. You can imagine the specification for prison mattress is quite particular, because you can't rip it apart and kill yourself and things like that. So they were thinking, what do we do about this? And they said, we want, rather than try and change the specification a tiny bit here, they said, in 3 years' time, we will only buy prison mattresses which are 100% recyclable. And they didn't know how to do it. So they said to the market, actually, this is what we need, and whoever comes up with the answer will get the contract for 60,000 mattresses every year. And of course the answer wasn't a different design mattress in the end. The answer was a service where they take them back in and do them over. So we don't know what the answer will be. We have to stimulate those kind of changes. And to give you an idea of just how significant this could be, take for example air pollution. The Sustainable Development Unit in the NHS has actually calculated that roughly around 1 in 8 cars in Britain, 1 in 8 journeys in Britain has something to do with public health. It's either for the NHS or people going to and from hospitals, or for social care or whatever. If you do a quick back of the envelope calculation on that in terms of this 1/8 of air pollution and deaths in this country, that means more people are probably dying because of air pollution associated with traffic in the NHS in this country than the NHS saves people in road traffic accidents. You know, absolutely astonishing. Why doesn't government just say in 5 years' time it will only buy cars that are zero emissions? And then the market will think that's such a huge thing, and it will stimulate amazing innovation and new products to come to the market and move the thing along. And guess what? You can do all that without any legislation. Why aren't we doing it?
Thank you. Amy?
Yeah, just picking up this point about different departments across government not necessarily working at cross purposes sometimes. I think, you know, obviously Secretary of State Michael Gove is doing a great job with DEFRA, and the real test of his leadership there will be to what extent that kind of mission is taken up across government. There was a really good sign that the Prime Minister delivered the speech launching the 25-year environment plan. But we sort of need to think constitutionally, really, about the environment. So if you take the EU treaties, which are sort of the constitutional documents of the EU, have environmental principles at their core. So we were talking about the polluter pays principle earlier, precautionary principle, and this sort of integrated approach. So everything the EU does has to be fundamentally kind of environmental. We should be thinking about that here in the UK, in the sort of post-Brexit world, and that's why I think an environment bill is so important here, because obviously our constitution's sort of a funny old thing, isn't it? It's made up of bits and bobs here and there, and let's think about the environment as part of our constitution, you know, governing ecologically. That would be a real sort of interesting innovation we could think about here, and again start talking with the rest of the world about that.
Brilliant. So one of the things I've been doing as chair of the Environment Agency, I am also sit on the board of DEFRA in an ex officio capacity. I'm now tapping into the networks of board members across different departments, inspired by the way the select committees are joining up and having conversations. So again, one of the things I think we should all be doing is mapping those areas of influence and getting conversations from different departments and different organisations to really link up some of these ideas. years, because we could just be getting on with it without this, also this great need for embedding change more formally. So I've got Mike here and John here, and please can we try and keep things pithy and short so that we can move on.
Well, I'll risk, can people hear me at the back there? Is that okay? Yeah. Mike Clark, RSPB's Chief Exec, and I just really want to build on Amy's point, because frankly, something I haven't heard at all yet is the constitutional means by which we can achieve the ends that is mainly what is being debated. We're having a repatriation of public policy. It's very energising, and everyone in the room is talking to each other. But the point is, we will have to relate to other trading blocs, other defence and security partnerships, and that means we've got to think about how constitution meshes. At the moment, in a week's time, if sufficient progress continues to be made, we'll be talking about the modality of Brexit. A free trade agreement and our common law system is inadequate to provide, firstly, the interpretive principles that exist currently legally through European law on polluter pays and the precautionary principle, and secondly, we already have a universal service obligation through the citizen rights that are recognised by European law. Effectively, citizens have a supervisory role in the common rule book. We are recognised as citizens and civil society having access to justice that isn't provided when the UK is in breach of treaty obligations. Under common law, that is not accessible to us if we simply come out as we are. So what I want to hear is, and I'll be interested in the views of the panel, is what are the constitutional measures that need to be put into place to allow us not only to relate to the EU, and in a week's time will we start to set the framework for that, but also how we then forge partnerships with other trading blocs.
So constitution, John, and then we've got two people with microphones, so can we make it quick?
Well, John Barley Clinton have estates, we've got about 30 tenant farms with our own organic dairies and such like. I'm not a farmer, I just want to run a large estate. The question is the role of government restoring natural capital. I'd like to focus on human capital and ask a question about that, because Kerry talks about more regulation, enforcement, and incentive, and I'm with you with all the points that have been made. We need lots of that. But equally, we need to understand that the majority of people we're trying to change behaviours of are running family farms and family businesses. And government needs to understand the drivers of family farms and businesses. So we need to be thinking outside the box, thinking about retirement planning, cash flow incentives, finance, capital investment, banks. And I think there's not just about the Department of Environment. We should be thinking about how can government work across DCLG, Department of Environment, skills, training, BENS. So my question is, how are we going to think about, how's government going to think about human capital to be able to deliver the restoration of natural capital, and how's it work across government?
Great, and then the two microphones, so yes, thank you, and then the one at the back.
Yeah, Nick Lampkin, I'm chair of the English Organic Forum. I'm slightly disappointed by some of the presentations today, which have sort of criticised the CAP based on a CAP of 20 years ago, in my view. Many of the things we're told about as initiatives are ones that can already be implemented under the current CAP. And I don't see that we're actually creating anything new that we couldn't be doing already, but that's another issue. My biggest concern, though, is at the moment we focus still on technological solutions. We don't focus on the ecological solutions, which I think are essential for rebuilding natural capital, and the systems like agroecology, organic farming, and so on that help to deliver that. Our competitor countries, France, Germany, Austria, Sweden, Italy, are all approaching or targeting 20% of their land to be organic. The UK has presided over a decline to less than 3%. We have a huge challenge to face there. That is one way that government could help restore natural capital. I welcome your views.
Thank you, and then again at the back.
Okay, my name's Derek Gow. I've worked in species restoration for perhaps 30 years. A Darwinian philosophy of captive breeding animals and reintroducing them. Trying to get money from government to do any of this stuff is virtually all but impossible. And I'm going to give you a dichotomy type situation here. In the past, we have had grants from the EA to breed some of the 22,000 water voles we bred for reintroduction since the early 2000s. I'm a farmer as well. So we can get no money from government to reintroduce wildcats or water voles or any of the other fragmented, destroyed elements of our natural flora and fauna. And yet, as a farmer, I am offered $114,000 this year to basically go into mid-tier stewardship for capital works to produce an environment that won't produce a single curlew, no living space for skylarks, nothing at all. It's shallow, it's designed to ensure that money is channeled back into farming and achieves absolutely no ecological good whatsoever. How does that work? How do we change that and make the money you're all spending much more effective?
Great. So I think we're almost coming to the end of the time we've been allocated. So I think if our panelists could respond to the questions, and if we start off with Zach.
Yeah, I'm going to also do reverse. I want to say one thing. Derek Gow, who just stood up and spoke, is one of our country's great heroes. And he really is. It's quite, his impact on this country's ecology is immeasurable. He is responsible for this shift we've seen towards the beaver reintroduction, for example, which actually answers the penultimate question we had about ecological solutions. The beaver is an ecological solution in many respects to water habitat restoration, to flood management, slowing down the water, creating catchments which benefit not only the ecology of the river, but actually slow the speed of water and reduce the cost downstream in terms of flooding. It's quite extraordinary. I wish I could delegate my answer to him, actually, because if he spoke to you for 2 minutes about the value of reintroductions, particularly of the beaver, which you mentioned the water vole, you would all fall in love with him, as I have. And so I'm going to say that his last question was the answer to the penultimate question. In relation to technological versus ecological solutions. It's a perfect example, I think. In terms of constitution, I know there was another human capital versus I'm going to have to go to the Constitution, because I'm going to remind myself what your question was. You make a really strong point that we had a pledge, day one, that EU environmental rules and regulations would be translated into UK law. So no one really doubted. That is in the withdrawal bill. That's happening. But there were two big questions after that. One of them was about the principles, which you mentioned, actually Amy also mentioned, and the other one was about governance. There was going to therefore be a governance gap. What was going to replace the Commission? What judicial process was going to step in order to hold government to account? And we have had a commitment from government, from Michael Gove, and with sign-off from government, so the Cabinet, that those principles will be written into legislation. So they will be there in legislation. The key principles in EU law, the precautionary principle, the polluter pays and others, will be there in primary legislation. But they will be backed up, and this is where I think we'll be in a better position tomorrow than we are in today. They will be backed up by a national policy statement which provides a proper definition of each of those principles. So you can have a principle about the polluter pays. But then if, in another arm, you define it in your national policy statement, or polluter pays, in order to, whatever, might allow us to build coal plants or something, clearly the two would be irreconcilable. So you'd have a national policy, national planning statement, a national policy statement, which would define, by Parliament, each and every one of those principles, which in turn would be referenced in primary legislation. We don't have that at the moment, so we'd be in a stronger position than we are currently in. And we'd have a body whose job would be to hold government to account, which would be paid for through public money, but would be answerable to Parliament, not government. And that would also enable people in this room, organisations, individuals, to challenge government actions through that body, which would have the ability to haul the government over the coals. And it's been a huge process to get to this stage. We've had huge battles in Parliament. A lot of help from Greener UK, Client Earth. I don't know if anyone in this room from Client Earth. We've had actually a number of recognisable faces in this room, people around the table with Michael Gove thrashing out what we believe is now a proper solution. Now, it doesn't yet exist in black and white for Parliament to scrutinise, and that is because there are elements of this which are still being battered around the Cabinet, and that's where the problem that Kerry identified, the battles between various people in Cabinet, will come out to play. But what I would say in relation to the politics of this is that this process, the one I just described, in addition to the process in relation to CAP reform, in addition to some of the other big environmental issues we've been talking about, have not just involved Michael Gove and his officials or a handful of ministers. It's involved a really significant number of Conservative MPs, a growing number. I felt isolated for 7 years of my time. I've been an MP for 8 years, minus a 6-month holiday I was given by my constituency last year. But I have felt pretty isolated for much of that time. I don't now. There is an appetite there. And for some people, it may be opportunistic. It may be that they've recognised that the public expects us to be responsible with these issues. For other people, it's a heartfelt cause, a genuine concern. But for whatever reason, there is a bigger number of people in the Conservative Party agitating, not just passively caring, but agitating on these issues than we've ever had before. And that's why I don't think it would be possible, particularly when you've got a government with a very small majority, I don't think it's possible for the government to take a step back away from this. I think we're on a path to doing something really good. But we've got to seize the moment, as Amy said in her summary.
So, Amy, would you like to make some comments?
Yes.
And perhaps we'll come back to human capital.
While we're on the constitutional point, because I think it's really exciting to hear what Zach was just saying about that sort of groundswell within the Conservative party agitating on these issues, and we've been working with parties across the House, in fact both houses, because there's so much passion there to make sure that we get this right for the environment, and that's really welcome and exciting. And we haven't actually, one of the features of being in the EU has meant that we haven't really had much environmental legislation going through our Houses of Parliament. So again, it's an opportunity for parliamentarians to really get involved with these issues again. On the subject of constitutional innovations, obviously the watchdog is going to be totally pivotal, really vital we get that right, and it has the independence and the resourcing to do its job well. As I mentioned earlier, the environment is not just a massive international concern, it's also highly devolved within the UK. So if we're thinking about constitutional innovations, we also need to be thinking about how the four governments of the UK and the four legislatures of the UK should be working together to keep that ambition, to mean that the UK's ambition taken internationally is jointly shared across those four nations, but also is delivered. We won't restore nature and kind of restore the functioning of these vital ecosystems if some countries are doing it better than others. And there needs to be a joint sort of holding each other to account, as well as relying on this independent enforcement body. I'll stop there because I know there's a lot more to say.
Who'd like to go next? And I think these have to be the closing comments because we're eating into our break time. So Craig and then Kerry, would you like to?
Yes, just to build on what Amy was saying about constitutional points, this is an incredibly important point about an enforcement agency. We need a really good, strong enforcement agency that has teeth, that can take the government to court. We see time and again, the number of times over the last few decades, Friends of the Earth has had to bring legal proceedings against successive UK governments for failing to really uphold EU environmental legislation. We've then had the backup of the European Commission, the European courts. So what's going to replace that? It is so important that we have a system we could go there. And you only have to look at the situation in Northern Ireland, actually, which is appalling, where, for years, the authorities of Northern Ireland have just failed to do what's required by the law. At the moment, we've got this case on Loch Ness, which is that big lake in the middle of Northern Ireland, and there's sand dredging there taking place without any planning permission or environmental impact assessments, completely opposite to the Birds Directive. So we absolutely need these, but the other thing I would say about it, we've got to move fast on this, because we've got to bear in mind a transition deal is not a given. That's going to be agreed by 27 member states, and it's going to be agreed by Wallonia and so on. There's all kinds of reasons it might not happen, and I'm scared that we're running out of time now, particularly when you don't have things like the precautionary principle.
So we're running out of time, so I'd like Kerry to
I'll try and do it very briefly.
Comments.
So I think Derek's stuff is amazing, and that's exactly what public money for public good should help fund. On the organic stuff, I chair the APPG Agroecology. We're going to be putting a submission to the command paper, and definitely organics is going to feature in there. On the family farms, again, I think in the command paper there's some pretty good stuff about trying to encourage farmers to diversify. I think the real challenge will be, how do you meet farmers' desire to have less bureaucracy and less measuring and monitoring and all the paperwork, but at the same time do enforce this regime of requiring more of them, but through the public goods. On Mike's point of view, I think scrutiny by Parliament of trade deals very much something that I'm been pushing for. And on the principles, I'm still a bit unclear as to where it is going to be enshrined in law, whether it's going to be in the governance bill or where. But I'll just give one example. I'm on the EFRA Select Committee as well, and we had Tim Brightmeyer from the CLA give evidence yesterday. We were talking about the command paper. And he said, I'm very worried as to what it says in there about this polluter pays thing. This is very concerning. I said, well, you do realise that principle has applied for many years now. And it seemed to be news to him. And then I said, why do you have a problem with it? And he said, well, you wouldn't, we could be accused of polluting when it could be somebody else, and there could be a whole mix, and how would you work out it's polluting? And I just thought that brought home to me the need to make these principles far clearer and enshrine them in law and in the policy framework, because clearly there's people out there that ought to be very much seized of the notion that the polluter pays principle that aren't.
So I think the forthcoming consultation on the scrutiny body is going to be absolutely key for those with an interest to pay close attention to it and send in responses. We're well out of time now. Thank you so much for coming along to this session. Thank you to our panelists.